Welcome back to this special compilation video from Vietnamese Case Files. Behind the fast-paced rhythm of life and the dream of building a new future abroad lie tragic hidden corners and shocking crimes that no one could have foreseen. In today's video, we will revisit 6 case files that once left the community stunned, where the line between family, love, and hatred becomes more fragile than ever. We will begin with a massacre in California, where a family of 3 paid with their lives over a debt tied to an old friend. Next comes the heartbreaking story of 10-year-old Aaron Vu, the victim of a senseless and brutal nail salon robbery. The video will also delve into cases rooted in psychological distortion, from a cold-blooded husband who held his wife's hand until her final breath over a burned passport, to a police officer who became a killer driven by blind jealousy. And it doesn't stop there. A savage revenge plot by a love-crazed perpetrator targeting a single mother raising 5 children, and the mystery of a phantom kitchen assistant who took a female chef's life at her workplace and then vanished without a trace. Each case is a costly warning about safety and a lesson in human nature. Stay with Vietnamese Case Files until the end to follow the grueling journey to justice for these unfortunate victims. And if you enjoy investigative true crime content and want to follow along with Vietnamese Case Files and upcoming cases, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss a single episode. Now, let's begin. On the morning of June 21st, 2022, an unusual 911 call led Altamonte Springs Police to the Gold Elm at Charter Point apartment complex on Ballard Street. On the other end was a middle-aged man. He said that earlier, his son had called a Chinese-American employee named Yang to ask why he was absent from work without any explanation. Unexpectedly, Yang confessed that he had just done something that can't be spoken of because he was furious that his wife had burned his passport. Hearing this, the boss had a bad feeling and immediately called the police. When officers and firefighters rushed to the Yang couple's apartment, the door was still locked from the inside. The apartment management had to use a spare key to let police in. Right away, they encountered a horrifying sight. A woman lay motionless in a bathtub filled with blood. There was a deep cut on the left side of her neck. Blood ran over her body and pooled around her abdomen. Medics quickly confirmed that she had died at the scene. Based on the wounds, police immediately determined this was a brutal homicide, and the victim had likely been attacked with a knife. Nearby, officers also found 2 pink rubber gloves lying around and a bottle of cleaning solution in the hallway, signs that the killer had tried to wipe down the scene to cover up the crime. Soon after, with help from someone who knew her, police quickly identified the victim as Quynh Pham, a Vietnamese woman born in 2001. Quynh was born and raised in Vietnam. Her entire family, her parents and siblings still lived back home. Determined and ambitious, Quynh came to the United States at a young age to study and build a life in what she believed was a land of promise. She settled in the Orlando area of Florida, where the Vietnamese community isn't large but is closely connected. To friends, Quynh was gentle, easygoing, and widely loved. Living far from her family, she quickly built a tight circle of close friends. People remember her as a girl who was always smiling, warm, approachable, and genuinely caring toward others. In late 2020, Quynh met Chen Yang, a Chinese-American man 1 year older than her, and the two soon began dating. In July 2021, after only a few months together, Quynh decided to marry Yang in her early 20s, hoping to build a stable future in the United States. That marriage likely carried many dreams on both sides. For Quynh, she believed she had found a safe harbor, a life partner who could understand her and protect her in a foreign land. That's why she poured her heart into their small family, while also supporting her husband in work and daily life. However, behind the happy image Quynh tried to maintain were quiet, growing storms. Far from her relatives, Quynh became emotionally dependent on her newlywed husband. Marital conflicts gradually emerged as the young couple struggled with financial pressure and cultural differences. Neighbors occasionally heard arguments coming from their apartment, but few could have imagined how serious things had become. In reality, Quynh had endured violence from her husband more than once, with no family nearby to protect her. She had even called police for help only to later withdraw her complaint, partly out of love and partly out of hope that he would change. But where was the husband Quynh trusted so completely? Police quickly realized that her husband, Chen Yang, age 22, was not in the apartment. Combined with the information provided by his boss, Investigators immediately made him the #1 suspect. A few hours later, Altamonte Springs police located Yang and arrested him without significant resistance. As he was led away in handcuffs, Yang looked chillingly calm and detached, as if he had mentally prepared for this outcome the moment he called his boss. However, officers noticed several self-inflicted cuts on his body. Because of those injuries, police took him to a hospital for a medical evaluation before booking him, and his first court appearance was postponed to the next day to allow his condition to stabilize. Although the paperwork took time, once faced with police, Yang soon confessed to the crime with an unsettling coldness. He said that on that fateful morning, he and his wife had a fierce argument over his passport being burned. In a rage, Yang used a knife to attack his wife's neck. When asked why he didn't stop before things went too far, Yang replied that he wasn't taught to stop halfway, suggesting he was the type of person who believed that once you start, you have to finish. This emotionless confession shocked even seasoned investigators. Yang also described a detail that haunted everyone. After the attack, he placed his wife in the bathtub, played music she loved, and held her hand for 10 minutes until she stopped breathing. During that entire time, he did not call for emergency help, even as he watched his wife struggle and suffer. These details exposed the brutality of the crime and raised haunting questions about humanity that left the local community shaken. Out of shock and curiosity, many people searched for information about Yang, what kind of person he had been, and how he could turn on his wife with such cold-blooded brutality. Information showed that Sichen Yang, born in 2000, was a Chinese-American young man. To those around him, Yang seemed quiet, reasonably educated, and had never had any serious criminal record before meeting Quynh. Yang's family currently lives in Florida. His mother doted on him, and she had never had to take her son to see a lawyer or appear in court until this homicide. Yang's arrest for killing his wife devastated her, because in the family's eyes, he had never gotten into trouble with the law. However, that did not mean Yang was a gentle husband. On the contrary, those who knew the couple's private life recognized clear signs that Sichen Yang was controlling, hot-tempered, and deeply patriarchal. He could appear normal in public, but behind closed doors, Yang could explode in anger over the smallest things. Notably, in January 2022, only half a year after the wedding, Yang was arrested for abusing Quynh. According to an Orange County, Florida sheriff's report, Quynh said her husband struck her in the face, leaving redness on her cheek. Yang was charged with domestic battery, and the couple temporarily separated. However, when the case moved to the prosecutor's office, Quynh refused to cooperate as a witness, meaning she would not testify against her husband. As a result, prosecutors were forced to drop the case. Perhaps at that time, Quynh believed Yang's promises to change, or she was trapped under the psychological pressure that many domestic violence victims experience, so she gave him another chance to come back. After narrowly escaping consequences, Sichen Yang did not reform. Over the next 5 months, from January to June 2022, police were called to intervene at the couple's home 3 times, twice in May and once in early June. These visits happened because neighbors reported disturbances or because Quynh herself called for help. Notably, during the most recent incident in June, just 11 days before Quynh was killed, police did not find Quynh injured as in previous calls. Instead, Yang showed signs of self-harm after an argument with his wife. At that point, frightened yet still sympathetic, Quynh begged officers to take Yang to a psychiatric facility to protect him. Police then detained Yang under a mental health protective hold. This showed Yang's mental state was becoming increasingly unstable, shifting from hurting others to get what he wanted to threatening to hurt himself as a way to manipulate his wife's emotions. In other words, Yang's personality revealed 2 opposing sides. One weak and self-destructive, the other frighteningly aggressive. That dangerous combination, along with a fragile ego and a controlling patriarchal mindset, turned Sichen Yang into a ticking time bomb inside his own home. At the time of the killing, Yang worked at a small business near Orlando. He was not unemployed or on the fringes of society. Rather, he was trying to present himself as the family's breadwinner. But financial pressure and the burden of being the sole support for a young wife far from home may have amplified his stress and fueled darker thoughts. It remains unclear whether the burned passport was truly Quynh's doing or whether it was only Yang's one-sided claim. But if Quynh did burn her husband's passport, it may have been the outcome of deep, irreparable conflict pushing her toward a desperate, extreme act. And regardless of the cause, For someone like Yang, obsessed with pride and determined to go all the way in every argument, it became the final straw, unleashing a rage that had been building inside him for a long time. With clear evidence and a confession from the killer, the Seminole County State Attorney's Office moved quickly to file charges. A grand jury was convened, and in less than 3 weeks, on July 12, 2022, Yang was formally indicted by the grand jury on a charge of first-degree murder. He remained in custody awaiting trial and was not granted bail. After the indictment, it seemed Quynh Yang would face a full-scale felony trial, with a life sentence all but certain. But no, the legal process took a different turn in late 2023 when Yang's attorney proactively proposed plea negotiations. With the evidence overwhelmingly clear and the suspect's confession on record, the defense knew the chances of winning at trial were virtually zero. To avoid a life sentence, or worse, the death penalty, Yang signaled he would plead guilty if the charges could be reduced. Prosecutors in Seminole County then consulted with the victim's family in Vietnam and the investigating police. In the end, they agreed to a plea deal. Yang would plead guilty to second-degree murder and tampering with evidence in exchange for a 40-year prison sentence. Quynh Pham's family also accepted this outcome to avoid enduring a long, painful trial. On February 20th, 2024, Quynh Yang was brought before the Seminole County Court to formally enter his plea and receive sentencing. He was now 24 years old, thin in an orange jail uniform, his face more hollow after nearly 2 years in custody. With no way out, he lowered his head and admitted the charges before Judge William Orth. The sentence was handed down immediately: 40 years in a Florida state prison for the homicide charge, plus court costs and fees totaling more than $11,000 USD. With this term, Quynh Yang would spend nearly all of his youth and middle age behind bars. Around the year 2062, in his 60s, he would have a chance at release. And although the agreement had already been approved, the hearing was still highly emotional. Yang was invited to speak before sentencing. For the first time since the crime, the perpetrator spoke through a choked voice and expressed remorse. "I want to send my whole heart to the family and friends of Quynh Pham as they continue to grieve their loss. I am deeply sorry to everyone who has been affected by my actions, and I take full responsibility for that." The late apology echoed through a silent courtroom. Below, a few of Quynh's friends quietly wiped away tears. Her parents in Vietnam could not be present, but one truth was undeniable: their grief was beyond measure. Quynh Yang's mother attended in full. She sobbed uncontrollably as she watched her son be sentenced, so shaken that she could not even stand firmly to answer reporters' questions. Defense attorney Jeff Dowdy said Yang's family was devastated and heartbroken. They had never imagined their son could become involved in something this severe. Still, they had to accept reality. Dowdy also said the 40-year plea deal was the best possible outcome for both sides. It was also the only door left that gave Yang the faint hope of living some years in freedom in old age rather than never at all. For the prosecution, Megan Homan, representing the state attorney's office, told the court that the 40-year sentence took into account the victim's family's wishes and reflected the necessary severity to deliver justice for Quynh Pham. The heartbreaking part is that had the justice system intervened more forcefully back in January 2022, Quynh might not have had to die in such pain. In court, they also revisited the fact that Yang had previously been arrested for domestic violence, but was released after the victim withdrew her statement. The prosecutor assigned to the grand jury remarked bitterly, 5 months after the domestic violence case was dropped, she was murdered, underscoring the painful reality of the cycle of domestic abuse. After the hearing, Quynh Yang was fingerprinted one last time and escorted back to a Florida state prison to begin his long sentence. His mother followed quietly behind, her tears still falling. Outside the courthouse, Quynh Pham's friends carried her portrait and prayed together. They made no public statements, but their eyes reflected immeasurable grief for their ill-fated friend. Justice spoke, but a young life full of hope was gone forever, beyond any repair. By April 2025, Quynh Yang filed an appeal on his own, arguing that the sentence was too harsh, but the Florida Appellate Court denied the appeal and upheld the 40-year sentence. So by the end of 2025, the case was fully closed procedurally. Quynh Yang must continue serving his sentence, with no remaining legal pathway to an earlier release. The murder of Quynh Pham left haunting aftershocks and painful lessons for the community. First, it shocked the public because of its brutality, and because the trigger was disturbingly trivial: a burned passport. From that, a domestic argument escalated into a savage killing. To many people, Yang's actions feel almost impossible to comprehend. How could a husband sit coldly, play music, and hold his wife's hand as she slowly died without calling for help? Some psychologists suggest this reflects a pattern seen in abusive offenders. After unleashing a lethal rage, the perpetrator may soften briefly and display a twisted form of affection toward the victim like a final act of possession. Yang's behavior showed both cruelty and a deeply distorted mindset. Perhaps he treated playing her favorite song as a kind of late apology, or worse, as a ritual turning her death into something he could frame as his own creation. This is a dangerous psychology, a killer persuading himself that he still loved the victim, even as he took her life with his own hands. Socially, the case is a stark warning about domestic violence, especially within immigrant communities. New Quynh Pham was a young Vietnamese woman living far from her family, and she may have faced serious obstacles in seeking help while being abused by her husband. Although she had called the police before, withdrawing the complaint and continuing to live with an abusive husband showed emotional dependence and hesitation, something very common among abuse victims. Sadly, as Linda Parker, a specialist with women in distress, stated, "He will never leave her alone. He's like a man on a mission to inflict as much pain as possible." In reality, misplaced forgiveness toward an abusive partner only emboldens them. And in Quynh's case, the authorities also hesitated, creating more opportunities for Yang to continue his pattern of violence until it ended in a tragic outcome. Therefore, this is a major lesson for law enforcement and protective agencies. Separate the victim from the abuser early and decisively, because a life can be lost after just one escalation. On the other hand, the case also highlights the impact of culture and individual psychology. Yang's line, "I couldn't stop because I wasn't taught how to stop," sparked intense debate. Some believe it was merely an excuse from an evil man. Others connect it to strict parenting styles in some East Asian families, where children are taught to go all the way and never let anyone look down on you. If not carefully shaped with compassion, that extreme mindset can turn into a toxic ego. Exichen Yang may have grown up under pressure to appear strong and never lose an argument, leading him to view stopping, even to save his wife's life, as weakness or disgrace. Of course, this is not a justification for his crime, but a reminder of how important character education and anger control are within families and relationships. What do you think turned Exichen Yang into someone so cold-blooded and unhinged upbringing? Family influence or his own choices? Share your thoughts in the comments. On the afternoon of May 29, 2006, Memorial Day in the United States, the unusual disappearance of Trish Lamb, a casino card dealer in San Bernardino, began to worry many of her coworkers. According to her schedule, she was supposed to be at work that day, but failed to show up without explanation. For 3 consecutive days after the holiday, repeated calls to Lamb's phone went unanswered, and her house remained tightly shut, giving those around her an ominous feeling. Eventually, a close coworker decided to contact the Garden Grove Police Department and requested a welfare check at her home. Shortly after receiving the report, Garden Grove police officers were dispatched to the house at 8711 Summercrest Circle. When no one responded to their knocking, officers were forced to break in. Inside, they were immediately confronted with a horrifying scene. In an upstairs office, police discovered the body of a man, while in a bedroom, they found the body of a woman. The horror did not end there. Officers also found the body of a young boy in his own room. All 3 victims were deceased and bore severe injuries. Police immediately secured the scene and notified the Criminal Investigation Division. From the very first glance, the crime scene revealed a level of brutality beyond imagination. Inside the well-kept 2-story home, clear signs of a prolonged and deliberate attack were visible. All 3 victims had their arms and legs tightly bound with electrical cords and speaker wires, their hands and feet restrained behind their backs in a painful position. The scene suggested they had almost no chance to fight back before the attack happened. Amid the horrific setting, investigators were stunned to discover a baby girl, apparently not yet 1 year old, still alive. She was lying on the floor of the primary bedroom, right beside the bed where her mother's body was found. The baby was barely moving, likely exhausted from hunger and thirst and suffering from severe dehydration. Miraculously, although there were signs she had been assaulted, she managed to hold on until she was discovered. Police quickly rushed her to the hospital for emergency treatment. Through identification work, police determined the man who died at the scene was Pham Le, 30 years old, Trish Lamb's husband. He was found collapsed in the home office with at least 16 stab wounds to the neck and head, and his skull had also been damaged by heavy blunt force. In addition, underwear and sleepwear had been stuffed into his mouth and tightly secured around his face, indicating the perpetrator tried to silence him so he could not call for help. Not far away, Trish Lamb, 25 years old, was found lying on the bed in the primary bedroom, partially covered by a pillow. Her mouth had been tightly stuffed with a baby bib and then wrapped with tape on the outside. The victim also had multiple fatal stab wounds on her back, along with a deep cut across her neck, reflecting the perpetrator's cold, decisive brutality. Most heartbreaking of all, Tommy, Trish's 6-year-old son, was found lifeless on his own bed, still wearing Spider-Man pajamas. He appeared to have been asleep when it happened, because there were no signs of resistance on his body. Even so, 5 stab wounds to the head took the life of a child who had only just started first grade. Bloodstains remained on the walls and ceiling of his bedroom like traces of a prolonged frenzy. Gradually, through accounts from relatives and archived records, the profiles of the unfortunate victims became clearer. Phung Hung Le, 30 years old, often called Sonny by friends, was a Vietnamese-American man who had once had a troubled past. According to police information, when he was younger, he had been involved in a street gang and served 6.5 years in prison for robbery, as well as property destruction while incarcerated. Around 2004 to 2005, after completing his sentence, Phung was determined to rebuild his life. He got a job as a sales associate at a furniture store in Garden Grove. The store owner said he was an outstanding salesperson, but had resigned about 1 year before the incident to stay home and care for his young child. Friends and relatives also described him as a responsible father, willing to set his career aside to focus entirely on his daughter. Trish Lam, whose Vietnamese name was Ngoc Lam, 25 years old, Phung's wife, was also of Vietnamese descent. She had a son from a previous relationship, Tommy, 6 years old. The mother and son found new happiness when Trish married Phung Hung a few years earlier. People around them described Trish Lam as gentle and hardworking. She worked at a casino and was well liked by her coworkers, who spoke highly of her performance. Financially, although the family was not wealthy, according to Trish's older sister, they did not face any serious financial hardship before the case occurred. Phung and Trish's life seemed to have gradually stabilized with their own home, relatively steady work, and well-behaved children. If there was anything notable, it was that Phung appeared quite cautious in his daily life. He had installed a security camera system both inside and outside the house, so he could monitor Caitlin whenever they hired a babysitter. Because friends knew he had a prison past, they were not surprised that Phung always locked the doors carefully and kept a gun under the mattress in the bedroom in case something went wrong. A relative also said that recently Phung had seemed tense, as if he was afraid of something, but he never explained what. As for the 2 children, Tommy was an innocent 6-year-old boy who had just finished kindergarten. He was very close to his stepfather and loved his younger half-sister, Caitlin. And Caitlin, only 11 months old, would likely grow up with no memory of that terrifying night. Yet in a single short night, she permanently lost her parents and her brother. Immediately after confirming the victims' identities, police began collecting clues at the scene. During the search, investigators paid special attention to a handwritten IOU dated April 2006. It indicated that Phung Hung owed a person named Quynh as much as $80,000. The lender's identity was quickly cross-checked against the known connections of Phung Hung Le. It did not take long for police to identify him as Quang Van Quan, 39 years old, living in Houston, Texas, who had been Phung's fellow inmate in the 1990s. Notably, Quanh's record showed he was considered highly dangerous. He had previously been convicted of robbery and assault. In particular, in 1990, Quynh broke into a family's home in Los Angeles, restrained the victims, and robbed them, a method that bore strong similarities to what had just happened in Garden Grove. After nearly 14 years in prison, Quynh was released on parole and was still under supervision in 2006. With 2 serious prior convictions, if he became involved in another major felony, Quynh would face life imprisonment. That meant if he was truly connected to the massacre, he would have a strong motive to flee. Garden Grove police quickly assessed Quynh as the #1 suspect. However, arresting him was not simple, because at that time Quynh was no longer in California. According to initial information, immediately after the homicide, he left Orange County and may have returned to Houston, his registered place of residence, or was hiding elsewhere. In response, California authorities immediately coordinated with the FBI and the Houston Police Department, and a nationwide warrant was issued for Quynh on suspicion of murder and robbery. In parallel with the manhunt, investigators continued gathering additional evidence to strengthen the link between Quynh and the case. Phone records from Phuong Hoong Le were extracted, showing that on the night of May 26, 2006, the victim received a total of 12 calls from Quynh's number. Notably, the final 6 calls were made late at night while that phone was very close to the victim's home. Beyond that, police were also able to recover a voicemail message that Quynh himself left for Phuong on the night of the incident. In the Vietnamese language recording, Quynh's voice sounded urgent as he asked to stay overnight at the victim's house. This indicated he had fabricated a reason to lure Phuong into opening the door. At the same time, the investigative team continued reviewing evidence from the scene. Fingerprint and DNA analysis from the bindings, tape, and several items inside the home confirmed that Quynh had been present at the crime scene. From anonymous sources, police also received additional leads about where the suspect might be hiding. On July 12, 2006, nearly 6 weeks after the crime, Quynh was arrested in Houston in a coordinated operation between local police and fugitive task forces. He was taken into custody while moving belongings from an acquaintance's home to another location, likely attempting to change hiding places when he was discovered. Shortly afterward, Quynh was extradited back to Orange County, California for investigation and prosecution. Notably, police believed Quynh did not act alone. From the beginning of the case, there were signs suggesting he had at least one accomplice. After Quynh's arrest, authorities continued searching for the identities of those individuals. They publicly urged anyone with information about someone who may have participated with Quynh to come forward. Even so, many years passed without any additional suspects being arrested. According to investigators, Quynh, 39 years old at the time he went on trial in 2010, was a Vietnamese-American with an extensive criminal history. Quynh grew up mostly in Los Angeles, California, became involved in gang activity early on, and quickly developed a reputation for trouble. Court records show that in 1990, Quynh was convicted in a burglary robbery case. He broke into a man's home in Los Angeles, tied the victim up, and used a weapon to threaten him while stealing money. For that crime, Quynh received a lengthy prison sentence of nearly 14 years. In addition, he also had a prior conviction for assault with a deadly weapon. With 2 serious prior convictions, under California's 3 strikes law, if he committed a 3rd felony, Quynh would almost certainly face life in prison. This helped explain his reckless mindset, knowing he would have no way out if he was caught. While serving his sentence in the California state prison system, Quynh met and became acquainted with a fellow Vietnamese inmate, Phuong Hoong Le. That relationship was later exploited for a criminal scheme. After spending more than a decade behind bars, Quynh was released and moved to Houston, Texas. There, he appeared to be trying to rebuild his life by opening a small import-export company. However, the company's actual operations were highly questionable. Authorities suspected Quynh used it to launder money or conceal illegal transactions. Quyhn's direct motive in the case was determined to be money. The unpaid debt of $80,000 drove him to act with brutal intent for retaliation. According to Quyhn's plan, in the early morning of May 27, 2006, after calling to request a place to stay overnight, he and an accomplice went to the victim's home carrying knives, bindings, and tape. Once inside, they quickly used force to control Phuong and his wife. Baby Caitlin was snatched from her mother's arms and thrown hard onto the floor, causing injuries, but fortunately, she survived. Phuong was bound and dragged up to the office, while Trish was separated and taken to the primary bedroom. After attacking the entire family and taking several valuable items, Quynh and his accomplice fled the scene. It was not until May 29, 2006, when Trish's coworker contacted police due to her unusual disappearance, that the crime was discovered. The 3 victims' bodies had remained inside the home for 2 days, while baby Caitlin was found severely dehydrated but still alive. Notably, this was not even Quynn's first offense after being released from prison. Earlier, he had violated parole conditions and was wanted in Texas, showing how difficult it was for him to abandon his criminal lifestyle. Throughout the investigation and trial, Quynh showed no signs of remorse. On the contrary, he repeatedly gave evasive statements in an attempt to avoid responsibility. It is clear that Quynh Van Quan displayed all the characteristics of a highly dangerous offender: an extensive criminal background, familiarity with violence, and a willingness to do anything to achieve his goal. In October 2010, after years of waiting, the trial of Quynh Van Quan officially began at the Orange County Superior Court in Santa Ana. The proceedings had stretched for nearly 4 years from the time of his arrest, due to the case's exceptional severity and the complexity of the legal process. At trial, Quynh was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with special circumstances enhancements, including committing the killings during a robbery and a burglary. In addition, Quynh's 2 serious prior convictions were also presented as aggravating factors against him. In court, Quynh appeared calm and cold, firmly maintaining a not guilty plea. However, faced with a clear and tightly constructed body of evidence, Quynh's defense had little room to change the outcome. Prosecutors established that the motive was financial. Quynh claimed that Pham had borrowed money from the wrong person and refused to repay it, which led him to decide to use violence to collect the debt. Prosecutors also stated that Phung Le had previously been involved with illegal substances and lived in fear after borrowing money from the criminal underworld. Meanwhile, Quynh, under the guise of a close former prison friend, was in fact the one who came to recover the debt through violence. On the other hand, Quynh's defense attorneys pursued a different strategy, shifting blame to someone else. They did not deny that Quynh had been at the scene, but argued that on the night of May 26th, he merely acted as a guide for a higher-level criminal, someone Phung allegedly owed money to. In his account, Quynh called this person Peter and blamed him, claiming that Peter pulled a gun, restrained Phung, tied up the victims, and then ordered Quynh to leave the scene before the most serious events occurred. Quynh portrayed himself as someone who had been dragged into it, insisting he could never harm a friend. To support his story, Quynh even identified a photo of Peter that police showed him. However, this claim was quickly exposed as false. The man in the photo was completely uninvolved, he was a former inmate wearing an ankle monitor and had a clear alibi on the night of the crime. This showed that Quynh deliberately chose someone with a criminal record to frame, not realizing that person had airtight proof of innocence. Faced with that situation, the defense was forced to shift focus, concentrating on creating doubt about Quynh's exact role. They argued there was no definitive basis to conclude Quynh was the one who directly carried out the killings, and that the possibility he was only an indirect accomplice remained open. Their goal was to make jurors question whether Quynh intended to kill from the outset, or whether he came only to collect a debt and then things spiraled out of control. However, under California law, the fact that Quynh actively participated in a robbery that resulted in loss of life was sufficient to constitute first-degree murder. After several intense weeks of trial, with dozens of witnesses and extensive evidence presented in court, the jury needed only 1 day of deliberations to reach a verdict. In October 2010, the court found Quynh Van Quan guilty of first-degree murder for all 3 victims. All special circumstance enhancements were confirmed as true, meaning Quynh was eligible to face either the death penalty or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Considering the defendant's background and the fact that an accomplice had still not been arrested, prosecutors decided not to pursue the death penalty. Instead, they recommended life imprisonment without parole to ensure Quynh would never have the chance to reoffend, while still leaving open the possibility that he could provide investigative information if needed. The judge agreed with this recommendation. On December 17th, 2010, Quynh Van Quan returned to court to hear sentencing. As the sentence was read, Quynh lowered his head in silence, while the victims' relatives embraced one another and broke down in tears. The man responsible would now spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for what he had done. The trial ended, but the case did not stop there. Later, due to changes in California law, Quynh Van Quan filed a petition seeking resentencing in an effort to reduce his conviction. He argued that he did not personally carry out the killings and did not intend to kill the victims, and that under the new law, he might not qualify for the highest level conviction. At first, the trial court denied the petition, stating that Quynh played an active, leading role in the crime and was not eligible for a reduction. However, in October 2023, the California Court of Appeal overturned that denial and ordered a new hearing after finding procedural violations. Specifically, Quynh's absence from the earlier hearing was found to have violated the defendant's constitutional rights. This meant that nearly 20 years after the crime, Quang Van Quan could still attempt to seek a reduced sentence through legal loopholes. As of now, the matter remains in the resentencing process. Even so, the judgment finding Quynh guilty on 3 murder counts remains in place. He has not been found not guilty, nor has his conviction been vacated. Only the question of whether he qualifies for a lesser degree of liability is being litigated. The massacre of Phuong Lê's family in 2006 left a lasting trauma in the community's memory. In terms of social impact, it remained a painful topic within overseas Vietnamese communities for a long time. American media, from California to Texas, reported continuously from the moment the crime was discovered through the suspect's arrest and conviction. In particular, the story of the baby who survived beside her mother's body left anyone who heard it shaken and heartbroken. After the tragedy, the community organized multiple fundraising efforts to support Caitlin. According to various sources, after being discharged from the hospital, she was placed in the care of relatives and continued to develop steadily. On social media, people still occasionally mention Caitlin as a miracle child, a symbol of extraordinary survival amid tragedy. And you, what do you think about the fact that nearly 20 years later, the perpetrator is still searching for every legal opening to seek a reduced sentence? Does someone who could harm an entire friend's family over money deserve any leniency from the law at all? Share your opinion in the comments. Around midnight on September 7th, 2022, the 911 operator received an emergency call from a home on Colebrook Lane. On the other end, a voice trembled with fear, saying that a stranger had forced the door open and rushed inside, holding a handgun at the ready. Before the call could even end, sharp gunshots suddenly rang out, followed by piercing screams coming through the phone. The dispatcher, horrified, clearly heard 6 consecutive shots before the line went silent. Understanding how critical the situation was, they immediately dispatched officers to the scene. Just minutes later, local police arrived on Colebrook Lane. They were met at once with a scene of devastation. The front door had been blown open and blood was smeared across the floor and walls. In the master bedroom, the bedsheets were rumpled and belongings were scattered, suggesting the attacker had struck without warning while the family was asleep. Most importantly, officers saw the couple, Benison Tran and his wife, Maria Tran, shot and gravely wounded, collapsed on the floor, their bodies soaked in blood. Nearby were the victim's 14-year-old son, Maria's mother, and her cousin. Everyone was screaming in agony and total collapse. The son could not believe his parents had just been killed right in front of him. Fortunately, amid the shock, the family members managed to give police a crucial lead. They recognized the shooter as someone they knew, Devin Williams, a police officer working in the area. This information was immediately relayed to patrol units, triggering a manhunt that began that very night. Patrol units received an alert for the suspect, Devin Williams, 24 years old. He was described as tall, armed, and fleeing south in a gray Volkswagen Jetta. At that time, Williams was still a deputy sheriff with the Alameda County Sheriff's Office. The fact that a fellow officer was implicated in such a serious case left many in shock. At the same time, everyone understood this was an especially dangerous mission because as colleagues, they knew exactly how thoroughly Williams had been trained. And with a weapon in hand, he could very likely resist violently or act recklessly and take his own life. Police quickly tracked Williams's phone signal. By late morning the next day, location data showed he was moving through a remote area near the city of Coalinga in Central California, about 240 kilometers from the crime scene. Meanwhile, at the scene, a team of investigators worked relentlessly to collect traces and evidence for prosecution. They recovered multiple cartridge casings from a Sig Sauer P320, a model issued to law enforcement. The fact that both victims were shot at close range in vital areas also suggested a revenge-style killing, clearly driven by intent to take lives, not a spontaneous act or a senseless outburst. The surviving witnesses, including the son and relatives of the Tran couple, were brought to headquarters to give detailed statements. They said Maria had known Devin Williams before and had even been involved in a shady romantic relationship with him, but later asked to end it. From that point on, Williams became visibly irritated. On the night of August 8th, 2022, the man even escalated to harassment, showing up at the Tran home, repeatedly ringing the doorbell and demanding to see Maria, frightening the couple into calling the police. However, the officer who handled the situation that night appeared to go easy on a colleague, offering only a brief warning and letting Williams leave, without filing a report or confiscating any weapon. Internal records from the Dublin Police Department also confirmed this incident, leaving investigators deeply troubled. Many believe that if their colleague had taken firmer action that night, disarming Williams or reporting his abnormal behavior, the tragedy might not have happened. The victim's family was also outraged, arguing that this favoritism for someone you know indirectly led to today's catastrophe. In parallel with witness interviews, police extracted data from the phones and messages of the victims and the suspect. From this, they obtained substantial evidence that Maria and Williams had indeed been in a romantic relationship, confirming what the family had reported. Maria had proactively ended the relationship, but Williams spiraled into an obsessive, near-manic fixation. His phone contained many messages sent to Maria that showed desperation and rage upon learning she was still living with her husband, signs of his psychological instability even before the crime. As the investigation raced forward, near noon on September 7th, less than 12 hours after the attack, Devin Williams unexpectedly called the Dublin Police Department and asked to turn himself in. Earlier, after hours of driving while on the run, Williams contacted his mother. Over the phone, Anitra Williams cried as she urged her son to face the truth and abandon any plan to take his own life. Persuaded by his mother, Williams agreed to call his superiors. Dublin Police Chief Garrett Holmes spoke with Williams directly for nearly 45 minutes, calming him down and persuading him to surrender. In the end, at around 12 noon, following instructions given over the phone, Williams pulled over on Interstate 5 near Coalinga and raised his hands to be taken into custody by a patrol unit. Police immediately seized Williams' Volkswagen Jetta. As for the gun, he claimed that while fleeing, he threw it off the roadside in the Altamont Pass area on the outskirts of Dublin. That same day, police cordoned off the Altamont area to search for this key piece of evidence, and by the next day, they recovered the firearm, confirming it matched the type used to kill the victims. Devin Williams was transported to Santa Rita Jail, ironically, the very place where he had once worked as a correctional officer. The young officer had now become a homicide suspect, and he was held without bail pending investigation. The investigation that followed continued to strengthen the case, supported by physical evidence, electronic evidence, and witness testimony. Every lead pointed to a clear conclusion. This was a murder rooted in a romantic conflict, with signs the killer had planned ahead and deliberately killed both members of the Tran couple. At the same time, an internal investigation within law enforcement was launched in parallel. The Alameda County Sheriff's Office reviewed hiring records and learned that Devin Williams Jr., 24 years old, a U.S. citizen, was born and raised in Stockton, California, a city about 80 kilometers from the crime scene. He graduated from a police academy and joined the Stockton Police Department in 2020, but did not pass his probationary period and was terminated after 1 year. In September 2021, Williams was hired as a deputy sheriff with Alameda County, primarily assigned to courthouse security and guarding duties at Santa Rita Jail. Williams's initial personnel file showed no criminal record or disciplinary violations. His supervisors even described him as a very promising candidate for the profession. However, the shocking truth was that Williams had previously been among the deputy applicants who failed the psychological evaluation, with an expert concluding he was not suitable to become an armed officer. Even so, due to staffing pressure and gaps in procedure, Williams was still hired and still issued a firearm. This discovery sparked public outrage and raised major questions about accountability in recruiting units within specialized agencies like police departments, when a young officer once seen as a good candidate ultimately became a cold-blooded killer. In his personal life, Williams was unmarried. His mother, Anitra Williams, said her son was quiet and easily swayed by emotion. She had repeatedly tried to warn him after noticing he had become involved with Maria Tran, a woman 16 years older than him. The two met in early 2022 at the hospital where Maria worked as a nurse at a time when Williams was escorting an inmate there for treatment. The relationship escalated quickly. They even traveled far away together for about 10 days like a couple. At the time, Williams believed Maria was single. Maria, meanwhile, lied that she was only 35, divorced, and raising her child alone. Because of that, Williams poured all of his feelings into Maria. Friends and coworkers later said he used to brag about his relationship with a wonderful woman, showing an intense, almost obsessive passion for her. Everything unraveled around August 2022 when Williams discovered that Maria was actually still living with her husband. The shock sent him into a severe psychological crisis. Williams's family said that from that point on, he barely ate or slept, and his personality changed dramatically. His mother felt her son was slowly losing himself, showing signs of depression and unusually volatile anger. Even so, no one, not even his colleagues in law enforcement, recognized how unstable Williams truly was until it was far too late. In terms of his connection to the victim, Williams had indeed dated and been romantically involved with Maria Tran. He was so infatuated that he fantasized about a future together. But when he learned Maria was still another man's wife, that love quickly curdled into hatred and jealousy. According to a psychologist's assessment in court, Williams showed signs of relationship obsession syndrome. He convinced himself that Maria belonged to him, and anything standing in the way, including her husband, became a target that needed to be removed. It must also be stated that before the crime, Williams had no criminal record and showed no openly violent behavior. That is why, when he struck with such brutality, everyone who had known him was stunned and shaken. Those close to him previously described Williams as gentle, somewhat reserved, and eager to advance in his career. But deep inside were psychological undercurrents no one could foresee. When the relationship collapsed, Williams completely lost control, sliding further into hatred and despair until the fateful night of September 7th, 2022. A damaging lie. On the victim's side, Maria Tran, 42 years old, was a Vietnamese-American nurse working at John George Psychiatric Hospital in San Leandro, California. To her family and friends, Maria was kind, intelligent, sweet, and generous, always ready to help others. According to her best friend, she had a beautiful soul, lived harmoniously with those around her, and was well liked by her coworkers. Maria had been married to Benison Tran for nearly 2 decades and had a teenage son. Although her marriage had its difficult periods, she still cared for her family and was loved by those close to her. Tragically, during her time working at the hospital, Maria became acquainted with Devin Williams, a law enforcement officer who frequently brought patients in for treatment, and the two began an affair. Maria hid this from her husband and presented herself as a single woman while seeing Williams. However, after a few months of passion, Maria came to her senses and decided to end the wrongful relationship, trying to return and repair things with her husband. And Benison Tran, 57 years old, was Maria's husband, a calm, steady man devoted to his family. He had worked as a civil engineer for the city of Santa Clara for nearly 30 years and had only retired in 2021. He had taken part in many major projects serving the city, and he was also active in volunteer work, distributing food to people in need during the pandemic. Because of that, he was widely respected by coworkers for his diligence and dedication. At a city council meeting held after his death, Santa Clara leaders observed a moment of silence and praised Benison as someone who always left a positive impression on colleagues and the community through his devotion and sincere attitude. What is even more heartbreaking is that on the night of the murders, Benison only heard suspicious noises and rushed out to protect his family, only to come face to face with the killer's gun. Before his final breath, Benison tried to stop the attacker from fleeing, an act of courage that, tragically, only led to him being shot down even more coldly. Benison's sacrifice breaks the heart of anyone who hears it. He died trying to protect his family from danger, leaving behind a son who lost both his father and his mother in an instant. After Devin Williams was arrested, the legal proceedings moved relatively quickly because the evidence was overwhelmingly clear. In September 2022, the Alameda County District Attorney's Office filed charges against Devin Williams Jr. on 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstance allegations for multiple victims. Williams made his first court appearance in late 2022 and pleaded not guilty to the charges. This is common in serious criminal cases, even when the evidence clearly points to the defendant as the perpetrator. The defense attempted to argue that Williams committed the crime while in an extreme state of emotional disturbance, steering the case toward a crime of sudden passion narrative in hopes of reducing criminal liability to lesser offenses. The case also drew intense public attention because the suspect was a police officer, and because systemic failures helped pave the way to the tragedy. In March 2024, at a preliminary hearing, the victims' family members appeared in large numbers, carrying portraits of Maria and Benison. They strongly objected upon learning that the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, led by Pamela Price, intended to drop the special circumstance allegations from the indictment. Dropping those special circumstances would mean that if convicted, Williams would not face life without the possibility of parole, but instead a standard life sentence, meaning he could still potentially seek parole in the future. They argued that the decision amounted to leniency towards someone who had been part of the law enforcement system, and that it was a profound insult to their grief. Maria's sister, Jenny Wong, told the court that Williams had used the privileges of being a police officer to plan a killing, yet prosecutors were trying to reduce the defendant's punishment. Public and family pressure grew so intense that Judge Paul DeLucchi was forced to deny the prosecution's request to remove the aggravating allegations. Later, in light of the evidence and developments during the formal proceedings, the prosecution also adjusted its strategy and firmly pursued first-degree murder charges against Devin Williams for both victims. The main trial took place in late September and early October 2024 at the Alameda County Superior Court. The image of the defendant, Devin Williams, still very young, sitting silently behind the defense table, stirred sympathy in some. But that feeling quickly gave way to a lump in the throat when eyes turned to the victim's family. The couple's son, who had just turned 16, quietly held his parents' memorial portraits, his gaze filled with an unspeakable pain. In court, the jury listened again to the recording of the 911 call from the night of the murders. Many people broke down in tears as the desperate sounds played. Frantic cries for help, a child screaming and sobbing, and the dry gunshots that ended 2 lives. Judge Jennifer Madden admitted it was the worst 911 call she had ever heard in her career on the bench. Prosecutor Ted McGarvey then laid out Williams' full sequence of actions, arguing that the defendant had a clear motive of jealousy, had planned in advance, and brought a gun to the victim's home at exactly midnight to carry out the attack. His earlier harassment in August and his prior preparation of a weapon showed this was calculated, fully meeting the elements of first-degree murder with premeditation. In contrast, the defense argued that Williams acted in an intense emotional upheaval after discovering the truth, claiming it was an impulsive act of love turned into madness, and urged the jury to consider that factor to reduce the charges. During arguments, the defense even made controversial claims that were seen as indirectly blaming the victim, implying that Maria's deception drove Williams into despair. Prosecutor McGarvey immediately pushed back forcefully, stating that Maria did not choose death and did not deserve such a tragic end simply because of past romantic mistakes. Many observers agreed, because in this case, only the person who pulled the trigger should be held responsible for the crime committed. In the end, after about a week of trial and deliberations, on October 3, 2024, the jury delivered its final verdict. Devin Williams was guilty of first-degree murder for both victims. As the verdict was read, Williams sat motionless, head lowered. He understood this was the inevitable outcome of what he had done. The victims' families held each other and wept, tears that carried some relief that justice had been served, even though nothing could ever make up for the loss of their loved ones. The judge then set sentencing for November 2024. At the sentencing hearing on November 12, 2024, the courtroom atmosphere was deeply emotional. The defendant, Williams, wearing an orange jail uniform, sat quietly beside his attorney. Behind him were a few relatives, including Williams' parents, their eyes red with tears. Across the aisle, Maria and Benison's family brought memorial portraits of the 2 victims. Their tears streamed throughout the victims' statements. The Tran couple's son, now without both his father and his mother, submitted a letter to the court filled with anguish. He wrote that he could not forgive what the defendant had done to his parents, that they did not deserve such an end, and that he himself did not deserve to lose both parents because of Williams' actions. The choked words of the 16-year-old left no one in the courtroom able to hold back tears. When it was time for his final statement, Devin Williams broke down in tears. His voice trembled as he admitted the pain he had caused, offered an apology, and said he did not expect to be forgiven because he himself would never forgive himself. Those belated words of remorse echoed through the heavy courtroom, but the victim's family remained cold-faced, staring at the killer with eyes filled with fury mixed with heartbreak. Before imposing sentence, Judge Jennifer Madden said sternly that there are crimes that do not deserve the leniency the defense had requested. She called Williams' actions intolerable and emphasized the execution-like, cold-blooded nature of the killings. The court therefore sentenced Devin Williams to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving at least 50 years, meaning that, in theory, He would have a chance at freedom only after he was past 70, a very slim possibility. Hearing the decision, Williams lowered his head, his shoulders trembling slightly, as if realizing that his life would now close behind bars, a price far too steep for a moment of madness. In addition to prison, the court also ordered the defendant to pay $12,818 in funeral expenses to the victim's family, along with other penalties as required by law. The trial ended in tears and a grief that would linger. The victims' families embraced as they left the courtroom, carrying the memorial portraits of Maria and Benison. Behind them, Williams' parents quietly supported each other as they walked out, accepting the reality that their only son would spend nearly his entire life behind bars. It was a bitter ending, but one fully deserved for the crime he committed. The murders of Benison and Maria Tran became a wake-up call for society and for law enforcement agencies. Above all, the case sounded an alarm about violence rooted in romantic relationships. In reality, this was a form of expanded domestic violence, where the perpetrator did not only attack a romantic partner, but also killed the victim's family. And although nothing can change the criminal nature of Williams' actions, it must also be said that Maria Tran deceived this man. That lie unintentionally laid the foundation for a relationship that was flawed at its root. In Williams' fragile emotional world, the lie was not merely concealment, it became an absolute belief, the anchor that allowed him to surrender his entire heart and build fantasies of a shared future upon it. However, the truth must be put back in its proper place. Maria's lie, while a serious moral wrong, was not a license for violence, and it can never be an excuse for any shooting. Millions of relationships collapse each year because of betrayal, deception, or jealousy, but only a tiny fraction end in bloodshed. The line between emotional pain and criminal violence lies in the perpetrator's choice. Williams crossed that line deliberately, bringing a gun, entering the victim's home, and pulling the trigger with cold intent, ending 2 innocent lives. This shows how dangerous an affair can become when it combines with an unstable psyche. In the Tran family's case in particular, they had sought police help early when Williams harassed them in August 2022, but complacency and an insider favoritism mindset within law enforcement meant the chance to prevent the tragedy was missed. This is a painful lesson that authorities must handle every violation equally without distinguishing between civilians and colleagues in the profession. Because when people's lives are at risk, there can be no exceptions. Second, the case exposed serious gaps in police hiring and personnel oversight. The fact that Devin Williams was issued a gun and a badge despite failing a psychological evaluation shows that the screening process had been treated too lightly. After the case, the Alameda County Sheriff's Office was forced to suspend 47 other deputy sheriffs after discovering they also did not meet the required psychological standards. This shook public trust in local law enforcement and created an urgent demand for reform. In fact, the Alameda County Sheriff then lost re-election in 2022. After taking office, the successor pledged to tighten recruitment, training, and internal oversight. And for society as a whole, this tragedy is a reminder that no badge or title can guarantee a person's character. Even a well-trained officer can become a criminal if they lack inner control and are not properly supervised. What about you? Do you agree with the sentence that was handed down? And from today's story, what lesson do you take for yourself and the people around you? On Friday night, November 22nd, 2013, the 3-member family of Lane Ma was busy wrapping up the day at Hong Kong Nails, located in Miami-Dade County, Florida. The woman was cleaning up and getting ready to close, while her husband, Hai Nam Vu, was playing with their 10-year-old son, Aaron Vu. But the warm family atmosphere was suddenly shattered by noise outside the door. Without warning, 2 armed men rushed into the salon. They pulled out firearms, threatened everyone, and shouted for money. The nail salon plunged into chaos. Customers and employees scattered to hide. Some screamed as the 2 robbers approached, and others tried to call 911. In that chaotic moment, cold, deafening gunshots rang out. Lane Ma watched in horror as her husband and son were shot and collapsed to the floor. The 2 robbers fled quickly, leaving behind a heartbreaking scene. Lane Ma rushed to hold Aaron's small, blood-soaked body, crying out his name in desperate anguish. Another family member who was present quickly helped administer first aid to the father and son and urged everyone to call an ambulance. Although Hai Nam Vu had been severely wounded in the shoulder, he still struggled toward his child. He kept calling Aaron's name, but the boy no longer responded. At 11 o'clock at night, an ambulance sped to the scene. Both Aaron and Hainam were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The father appeared to fade from severe blood loss, while the 10-year-old boy fell into a deep coma. Then the terrible news arrived. Aaron Vu did not survive due to the severity of his injuries, while his father was taken into emergency surgery. Family and friends received calls in the middle of the night, shocked, devastated, and heartbroken beyond words. The heartbreaking case, witnessed firsthand by the boy's mother and people who knew the victim, was immediately reported to the North Miami police. Within minutes, the first investigators arrived and began a race against time to track down the perpetrators. The crime scene was haunting even for the most seasoned detectives. Inside the small nail salon, chairs and tables were knocked over, bottles of nail polish shattered across the floor, mixed with dark red bloodstains. Aaron Vu's body lay near the entrance, surrounded by scattered shell casings. His father, who had been severely injured, had already been taken away for emergency treatment, leaving behind a blood-soaked shirt and mud-stained combat boots. Terror was still etched on the faces of the witnesses. Some nail technicians and customers were still trembling, breaking into sobs as they described what happened. They said the two attackers stormed into the salon like predators, shoved firearms toward everyone, and shouted in street slang, demanding all the money. They decisively grabbed cash from the register drawer and rummaged through customers' wallets. With shaking voices, some witnesses told investigators that before fleeing, one robber suddenly turned back and fired without mercy toward the owner's family. 2 shots, one hit Aaron and the other lodged in Hainam's shoulder. That detail sent chills through the investigators. It seemed they fired simply to satisfy cruelty, because the victims had offered no resistance at all. At the scene, police recovered the salon's security video, revealing the first crucial lead. The entire brazen robbery had been clearly recorded. The footage showed 2 young men with their faces partially covered, rushing into the salon with firearms. They moved fast and acted coldly. Notably, while exiting, one robber pulled his face covering down, exposing his face clearly to the camera. Investigators immediately extracted still images from the video. It showed the face of an African-descended young man, roughly 18 to 20 years old. That night, police secured the scene, collected shell casings for ballistic analysis, and began searching for traces around the salon. A witness outside reported seeing the 2 suspects jump into a black pickup truck and speed away. This matched the appearance of a black Dodge Ram captured by the salon's security camera. The first pieces of the puzzle were now in place, allowing investigators to form an initial picture of the crime. This was a targeted armed robbery. The perpetrators came with weapons and were willing to pull the trigger without provocation. Their target was cash from the salon and from customers getting their nails done. But the estimated amount stolen was only about $300, an unbearably small sum compared to the life of a child. Aaron Vu was born in 2003 and was in 5th grade. He was the first child of Hainam Vu and Linh Ma. Aaron was lively, affectionate, and well-behaved. Friends and relatives described him as funny and kind, always trying to make the people around him laugh. He loved soccer, enjoyed video games, and often helped his parents with small tasks at the nail salon after school. Aaron's mother, Linh Ma, loved her son so much that she had reduced her working hours the year before to spend more time caring for Aaron and his younger sibling. The Vu family lived in Miramar, a city near Miami, but every day the parents drove more than 20 kilometers to the North Miami-Dade area to run Hong Kong nails. The salon was well known locally and supported by many regular customers, an achievement built through years of hard work by the Vietnamese immigrant couple. Hainam Vu, Aaron's father, had served in the United States Marine Corps, then left the military and moved into business. Neighbors respected him for his discipline, responsibility, and willingness to help others. In the eyes of the local Vietnamese community, the Vu family was a model of perseverance. They worked hard, raised a good child, and stayed closely connected to their church and school community. Aaron grew up surrounded by his parents' love. He was always polite and did well in school. That is why his death not only left an unhealable wound for his family, but also cast a deep silence over the entire local Vietnamese community. Determined to bring justice for Aaron, investigators from the Miami-Dade Police Department issued an alert across the entire unit that very night and launched a manhunt for the perpetrators. Early assessments focused on the hypothesis that this was a planned robbery. The lieutenant in charge of the crime scene investigation believed the primary objective was cash, while the armed assault was meant as intimidation. Even so, authorities did not rule out the possibility that this crew had committed crimes elsewhere and was willing to shoot in order to conceal their identities. With that analysis, evidence collection was carried out urgently to prevent more similar killing. Investigators combed through every millimeter of the scene and recovered several .40 caliber shell casings, along with bullet impacts on the wall. Preliminary analysis suggested the gunmen used a compact semi-automatic handgun, most likely a common Glock or Sig Sauer model. Crime scene technicians also found several unfamiliar fingerprints on the cash register counter and certain objects, but this lead seemed unlikely to pay off because the salon was a public place and prints could have belonged to many customers and employees. The most critical clue was the image of one suspect captured by the salon's camera. That image was printed and distributed to all patrol units. Suspect number 1 was described as a young man of color with an average build, wearing a black t-shirt and a round knit cap. He held the gun in his right hand, and his decisive movements suggested prior criminal experience. Meanwhile, suspect number 2 was a young man with his face covered by a red bandana, with a similar build to his accomplice. Both appeared very young and extremely reckless. To quickly identify the two men, mobilizing tips from the community became the key. The victim's family and police jointly held a press conference on Monday afternoon, November 25th. Appearing before the media with his arms still bandaged, his face gaunt, and seated in a wheelchair after leaving intensive care at Ryder Trauma Center, Hai Nam Vu fought back grief as he pleaded for the public's help in finding the person who had killed his son. His anguished words moved many people across Florida. That same day, Miami-Dade police announced the reward for information would be increased to $25,000. Officers went door to door in nearby neighborhoods, distributing thousands of flyers with the suspect's photos and asking for leads. On local news broadcasts, the image of Aaron smiling beside his family appeared next to the cold face of the suspect, fueling a wave of outrage and a shared determination that Miami had to catch the killers as soon as possible. The appeal quickly produced results. Within just a few days, the Miami-Dade Crime Stoppers hotline received around 100 tips from the public. Most were reports of people who had seen someone resembling the suspect or had heard someone bragging about being involved. Amid that flood of information, one anonymous call on the night of November 26th became a turning point. On the other end was the voice of a young man whispering that he recognized the person in the photo. He said the suspect's name was Anthon, and he even knew that Anthon was staying at his sister's house. Using that information, police quickly cross-checked their records and narrowed in on a matching individual, Anthon Reagan Jr., born on November 26, 1994, turning 19 years old on that very day. This was not an unfamiliar name to law enforcement. According to records, Anthon was born and raised in a family steeped in criminal history, with both his father and his uncle serving prison sentences for homicide. As a result, he had already become a troubled figure at an early age. He was first arrested at 13 for assaulting a school employee. After that, Reagan's record only grew thicker, including theft, illegal weapons, possession, and petty robberies. At 17, he and accomplices carried out an armed robbery and were arrested. But because he was not yet legally treated as an adult, he was placed in Miami-Dade County's Juvenile Detention Rehabilitation Program for several months. After completing that program in 2013, Reagan did not reform. He did not pursue school or hold any steady job. Instead, he lingered with older street gang members, looking for fast money through crime, while still under local juvenile supervision. An arrest warrant for Reagan was issued immediately. On the night of November 26, 2013, a police tactical unit raided a house on NW 53rd Street in Miami, the home of Anthon's sister. As the tip had indicated, under cover of darkness, officers surrounded the house and used a loudspeaker to order those inside to surrender. At first, there was no response, but after several tense minutes, a woman identified as Anthon's sister opened the door and stepped out, visibly frightened. Stammering, she said her brother was in a bedroom and had a weapon. After confirming there was no one else inside, the tactical team moved in. In the bedroom, Anthon Regan Jr. was hiding under a blanket, curled into a corner of the bed. When officers pulled him out, he struggled violently and resisted fiercely, causing one officer to suffer a minor injury. Police had to force him to the ground and secure his hands before they could fully control the situation. During a search, officers recovered a .40 caliber Glock 23 handgun and several suspicious items such as cash and jewelry. Anthon Regan Jr. was formally taken into custody, ending 4 days on the run. He was transported to the Turner Guilford Night Correctional Center that same night on his 19th birthday. A bitterly ironic image, a young man newly of age already facing the full weight of the law. Meanwhile, evidence collection and analysis intensified after the arrest to strengthen the case file. At his sister's home, police recovered a red bandana believed to have been used by suspect number 2 to cover his face, along with clothing that matched what was seen in the video. Regan's Glock 23 was sent for ballistic testing against the shell casings recovered at the crime scene. The results confirmed a match, indicating that this weapon fired the bullet that killed Aaron Vu. In addition, GPS data from Anthon Regan's mobile phone showed that on the night of November 22, 2013, his phone was in the area of Hong Kong Nails, matching the time of the crime. With this solid evidence, Miami-Dade police charged Anthon Regan with first-degree murder, attempted murder, armed robbery, and battery on a law enforcement officer. However, the case did not end there. The investigation continued, focused on hunting down the second accomplice. Throughout Regan's interrogation, he stubbornly remained silent and refused to provide any information about his accomplice. He only insisted that he didn't shoot anyone and demanded a lawyer. Leads on the remaining suspect shifted to other channels. Based on witness statements and intelligence, police suspected the second man might be a friend or relative of Regan, someone who had spent time running the streets with him. One name that surfaced was Terry Allen Neely, 24 years old, a person known to be close to Regan within the group of younger street associates. Neely had a record for petty theft and was believed to have been frequently seen with Regan in recent months. However, because investigators still lacked direct evidence to charge him, they could only keep Neely under discreet surveillance. But the case took an unexpected turn, stemming from the suspect already in custody. In early 2014, Anthon Regan faced additional charges tied to a string of other crimes. First, based on objective evidence collected, police discovered that Regan's firearm was also linked to the killing of Luis Miguel Perez, 21 years old, on November 1st, 2013 at Motel 7 in North Miami. That case had previously remained unsolved. The victim was believed to be a low-level drug dealer who was shot on a motel staircase. Security footage from Motel 7 also captured an attacker who strongly resembled Regan. And it didn't stop there. Regan was also suspected of shooting and injuring a cyclist named Kevin Burke on November 7, 2013. Burke survived and later identified Regan. In addition, Regan was tied to a brazen robbery at a Royal Castle fast food restaurant on November 9, 2013, where a female employee said he pressed a gun to her head and stole money. He was even believed to have robbed a laundromat and a dollar store near the nail salon during that same November. All of these crimes occurred within the first 3 weeks of November 2013, forming a shocking crime spree. The media called it Anthon Regan's Mad November. And it was from these very cases that police gained enough grounds to arrest Terry Allen Neely. At that time, it had not yet been proven that Neely was the masked man in the Aaron Vu case, but he was still put in handcuffs after being identified as an accomplice in the Motel 7 incident. From the leads and statements they gathered, police successfully reconstructed the full sequence of this November crime spree. On the night of November 1st, 2013, Anthon Regan drove around North Miami with Terry Neely looking for opportunities. Both carried weapons, intending to rob small-time dealers of goods or cash. At Motel 7, they spotted Luis Miguel Perez sitting on the stairs. Suspecting he was carrying product, Regan and Neely approached, pretending to ask to buy. Suddenly, Regan pulled his gun and shot Perez in the chest, while Neely searched him and took a package and the victim's wallet. The two fled immediately afterward. On November 7th, 2013, Regan drove around the streets late at night. He happened to see Kevin Burke riding his bicycle home. Perhaps simply because Burke caught his eye, Reagan then aimed and fired, dropping Burke to the ground before speeding away. Burke was critically injured and remained in a coma for nearly a month, but he survived. Burke later stated that he had never known Reagan and had no prior conflict with him. He had become a target purely at random, chosen by Reagan's hunger for violence. On November 9th, 2013, it was another night of hustling for Reagan and his accomplice. He stormed into the Royal Castle Burger restaurant in North Miami, pressed a gun to the cashier's head, and shouted for her to open the register. Terrified, the employee complied and handed over a few $100s. Before leaving, Reagan warned everyone to lie down on the floor, then fled. No one was shot in this robbery, but the restaurant's security camera captured images of the robber that closely resembled Reagan. In mid-November 2013, Reagan and Terry continued committing a series of petty robberies to get spending money and buy drugs. They robbed a laundromat near Liberty City, taking cash and belongings, and days later hit a dollar store near Hong Kong Nails, stealing a small amount of cash and merchandise. These incidents received little attention at the time because the losses were minor and no one was seriously injured. But taken together, they showed that Reagan was becoming increasingly reckless, almost intoxicated by how easy it had been to take money throughout November. By November 22nd, 2013, this thug reached the peak of his crime spree. That night, Reagan suggested to Neely that they pull a big one, believing service businesses would have more cash at the end of the day. They brought 2 firearms and chose Hong Kong Nails as their target. At 7:45 in the evening, Reagan drove a black Dodge pickup with Neely inside and parked on a corner a few houses away, the engine still running. Both got out, Reagan holding a gun, Neely grabbing a red cloth to wrap over his face. Then they suddenly rushed straight into the salon. Just as the camera later captured, they shouted threats and ordered everyone to raise their hands and get down on the floor. Reagan aimed his gun at the cashier counter and demanded money, while Neely snatched wallets and phones from several customers and nail technicians. In just over a minute, they collected about $300 and a few small items. As the two turned and ran toward the exit, Aaron Vu, who was lying on the floor holding his mother, slightly lifted his head in fear and looked after them. In that instant, it may have caught Reagan's eye. The robber suddenly stopped at the doorway and swung his gun back toward Lane Ma's family. Without warning, he fired 2 shots in rapid succession. The first bullet struck young Aaron in the chest from a distance of just over 3 meters. The second grazed Hai Nam Vu's shoulder, dropping him to the floor. After that brutal display, Reagan ran outside, and he and Neely escaped in the Dodge. Everything happened so fast that some witnesses outside only saw the suspect's vehicle speeding away and could not remember the license plate. Left behind was a heartbreaking scene. Aaron Vu collapsed on the salon floor beside his badly wounded father, while innocent people stood in utter shock. Once prosecutors were able to connect the cases, the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office decided to split them into 2 main case files, one for the killing of Luis Perez and one for the killing of Aaron Vu, along with related charges. The prosecution's strategy appeared aimed at ensuring Reagan faced the maximum penalty in both cases, especially considering the possibility of the death penalty for the killing of a child. Meanwhile, after Terry Neely was arrested in 2014, he grew fearful of potentially facing the death penalty, like Reagan. By 2020, he agreed to plead guilty and cooperate in exchange for a lesser sentence, around 20 years in prison. In return, Neely promised to testify against Reagan. This was a critical move by prosecutors to seal a death sentence for Reagan in the Aaron Vu case. Nearly 12 years after that fateful night in 2025, the case against Anthon Reagan was finally brought to trial. The legal process had stretched on in part because Reagan had to appear in court repeatedly for multiple charges stemming from his 2013 crime spree. The first trial, regarding the killing of Luis Perez, took place in early 2025 at the Miami-Dade County Criminal Court. Although this case was not directly connected to Aaron, what happened in that courtroom had a major impact on how the Aaron case would be handled later. Anthon Reagan faced a first-degree murder charge, and the state of Florida sought the death penalty. The evidence against Reagan in the Perez case was highly persuasive, from security footage to statements contained in Neely's plea agreement. Even though, in court, Terry Neely unexpectedly backtracked and claimed he had never agreed to testify against Reagan, the overall evidence was already overwhelming. After only a few days of arguments, the jury quickly found Reagan guilty of first-degree murder. The case then moved into the penalty phase. At that stage, Hai Nam Vu was also called to the stand as an impact witness to demonstrate just how dangerous and inhumane Reagan was. Facing the man who had taken his son's life in court, Vu trembled slightly, yet his eyes remained firm as he looked straight at Reagan and unequivocally confirmed the defendant's brutality. The jury then deliberated for just 2 hours before recommending life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, rather than the death penalty, for Reagan in the Perez case. That recommendation was based on the jury's consideration of Reagan's young age and certain mitigating factors. On May 8, 2025, the court sentenced Anthon Reagan to life in prison without parole for first-degree murder. In addition, during 2025, Reagan also received sentences for other crimes in the November spree: 60 years for the Royal Castle robbery, 37 years for shooting Kevin Burke, and several other lesser sentences. As for the killing of Aaron Vu, the trial is currently expected to take place in 2026. At present, pretrial proceedings are still being prepared due to the case's complexity and the prosecution's intent to secure the highest possible outcome for Reagan, removing him from society permanently. On the defense side, attorneys may continue to present mitigating arguments, such as a troubled childhood, mental illness, or the claim that it is unfair for Neely to receive roughly 20 years while Reagan faces the death penalty. However, because Neely has already pleaded guilty, Reagan cannot credibly deny his leading role in the shooting. Even so, to this day, he continues to deny the charges and remains determined to fight the case to the end. At around 9 a.m. on March 9th, 2018, a fierce fire broke out at a house located in the 2900 block of Hastings Drive in Grand Prairie. Smelling thick smoke spreading through the air, residents panicked and immediately called the fire department. When firefighters arrived, the flames had already engulfed the entire house, and it took some time before they could bring the fire under control. After the blaze was extinguished, inside the devastated home, rescue crews were shocked to discover the charred body of a woman. Grand Prairie police were immediately notified to investigate the fatal fire. Almost at the same time, just as the body inside the burned house was discovered, Grand Prairie police received another 911 call. This report concerned a fight and an intentional arson attack at Lakeside Nail Salon on Magna Carta Road, located less than half a mile from the house fire. The caller reported that an unknown man carrying a gun was assaulting a female employee and pouring gasoline with the intent to kill her inside the salon. According to witnesses, before police could arrive, several employees working at a nearby real estate office heard the cries for help and rushed over to intervene. When they arrived, they saw the salon's cashier counter on fire, while the attacker stood there holding a lighter and a handgun. At the moment when he became flustered because the gun malfunctioned and failed to fire, a man quickly drew his own firearm and subdued the suspect. Immediately afterward, police units rushed into the nail salon and arrested the attacker, leaving witnesses in shock. He was taken to the station with his clothes reeking of gasoline, and he had several minor burns on his body after flames from the burning pickup truck caught onto him. In just a few minutes on that fateful morning, 2 fires broke out, not far from each other. One was a severe house fire, and the other was a brazen attack at a nail salon. At first, investigators approached each scene as a separate incident. No one thought the 2 horrific events were closely connected until the first clues gradually began to surface. At the scene of the house on Hastings Drive, the sight was utterly tragic. The single-story home had been largely burned down, with smoke still smoldering from the collapsed roof. Inside, furniture was charred black, and the acrid smell of gasoline and burned materials hit the investigation team immediately. The victim's body was found on the floor, severely disfigured. However, during the initial examination, investigators noticed that the victim had not died solely from the fire. There were also multiple knife-inflicted wounds on her body. This detail meant the scene could no longer be treated as an ordinary house fire. Instead, it was clearly a homicide staged to look like an arson incident. Right next to the body, police recovered several key clues, including a dented metal lighter lying nearby, along with a strong gasoline odor lingering on the floor. These signs indicated the fire had been set deliberately. So, who was the target? To answer that question, police first focused on identifying the unfortunate woman in the burned house. The body was badly damaged, making identification extremely difficult. Investigators had to meticulously collect every remaining identifying detail and compare it with the residence records for the home. From there, they determined the house belonged to an Asian woman, nearly 40 years old, who lived with her young children. At that moment, a woman who identified herself as a friend of the homeowner, named Lan Vong, arrived at the scene after hearing the news. Speaking with investigators, Lan said the house belonged to a single mother named Pham. This information quickly helped police confirm the victim's identity. Meanwhile, at the parking lot of the shopping center on Magna Carta Road, the second scene, more suspicious evidence was also found. A pickup truck had burned down completely, leaving only the frame. Inside Lakeside Nail Salon, signs of a struggle were clearly visible. Shattered glass was scattered everywhere. The floor was stained with a mixture of gasoline and nail chemicals, with a sharp, pungent odor, and the cashier counter was scorched. Not long before, the salon's female employee had been taken to the hospital. She had been struck multiple times with the butt of a gun, causing head bleeding, but fortunately, she survived. When interviewed, trembling witnesses described the terrifying moment the attacker stormed into the salon with a murderous look on his face. He poured gasoline over the employee and tried to ignite it, but luckily the lighter failed to catch. Right after that, he drew his gun and pulled the trigger, but the firearm did not fire, as if something kept stopping him from committing further violence. At the same time, employees from the neighboring office rushed in to intervene. Without their timely arrival, the outcome could have been far more catastrophic. Meanwhile, at the police station, officers focused on identifying the man arrested at the nail salon. Immediately, two incidents that had seemed unrelated were connected as one. Police now had grounds to suspect that both events that morning were carried out by the same perpetrator, Billy Son Nguyen. From that point, investigators focused on clarifying the background details and the relationships involved in order to explain the motive behind this tragedy. According to the investigation, the victim in the first fire was Pham, 38 years old, born and raised within the Vietnamese community in Texas. Those who knew her described her as hardworking, gentle, and always putting family first. Before her death, Chi was a single mother raising two young children on her own. But the hardship did not stop there. Just 1 year earlier, her older sister had passed away after a serious illness, leaving behind 3 children. Out of compassion for her orphaned nieces and nephews, Chi took all 3 in, together with her 2 biological children that made 5 kids she was supporting entirely by herself. Because of that, outside of work, Pham devoted nearly all of her time to her family. Raising 5 children alone left her with almost no personal life. Friends said Chi deeply loved her children and nieces and nephews, always working tirelessly in hopes of giving them a more stable life. Even so, relatives and friends recalled that Chi remained optimistic and full of life. As for her job, Pham worked as a nail technician at Lakeside Nail Salon, the same place where the second fire occurred. The salon employed many Vietnamese workers. Chi herself was well-liked by coworkers and trusted by customers. According to Lan Vong, Pham's close friend, it was at this nail salon around early 2018 that the victim met and began dating a male coworker nearly 10 years older than her. That man was Hung Son Nguyen, also known as Billy. Lan said that at first, Pham seemed excited about the new relationship. Perhaps because she longed for emotional support and hoped the man could share the burden of her family and bring a happier life for her and her children, Chi opened her heart and accepted Billy Nguyen's affection. However, the budding relationship quickly fractured after only a few months. People who knew them believed many intense conflicts had occurred between the two. A few days before the crimes, Pham ended the relationship and demanded that Billy Nguyen leave her home. This was considered the direct cause of the perpetrator's later rage. After Chi died, 5 children lost a mother and a beloved aunt, becoming indirect victims who would bear the heaviest consequences. The image of a hard-working Vietnamese woman devoted entirely to her family, yet meeting a horrific end at the hands of someone once close to her, left a deep and haunting impact on overseas Vietnamese communities at that time. Immediately after identifying the victim and the suspect, Grand Prairie Police, working with investigators from Tarrant County, launched an in-depth investigation covering both scenes. 2 objectives were pursued in parallel: collecting complete forensic evidence to hold the perpetrator accountable under the law, and reconstructing the full sequence of events to clarify the motive and method of the crimes. Crime scene processing and forensic examination at the burned house were conducted under especially strict procedures. The autopsy confirmed that the victim, Pham, died from multiple stab wounds, striking vital areas and causing acute blood loss before the fire ignited. This finding clearly established that it was a serious homicide, not a death caused by the fire. In addition, fire investigators determined that the blaze showed clear signs of deliberate arson. Inside the house, there were multiple ignition points set at the same time, along with widespread traces of gasoline or fuel across the floor and household items. The lighter found at the scene and the lingering gasoline odor showed a clear similarity to what was recovered at the nail salon, strengthening the theory that the perpetrator used the same method at both locations. In addition, from the ashes inside the house, police recovered a kitchen knife with a bent blade and blood on it, believed to be the weapon. All of these pieces of evidence were sealed for investigative purposes. In parallel, at Lakeside Nail Salon, crime scene processing was also carried out urgently. Police seized an old plastic container with a capacity of about 5 liters that had been discarded in a corner with gasoline residue inside, likely brought by the suspect to carry out the intended arson. The suspect's firearm was also seized at the scene. Upon inspection, it was a .38 caliber revolver with 5 rounds still loaded in the cylinder. The gun had a jam in the barrel, explaining why it failed to fire when the suspect pulled the trigger. The lighter used by the perpetrator at the nail salon was also found lying under a manicure table. It showed signs of gasoline contamination, which dampened the flint and prevented it from igniting. Every small trace in the nail salon was carefully collected not only to reconstruct the attack, but also to directly link the suspect to the criminal acts. At the same time, police interviewed witnesses. The surviving female employee, after receiving initial treatment, tearfully recounted what had happened. She was a close friend of Pham at Lakeside Nail Salon. According to her, the salon opened as usual that morning. Before customers arrived in large numbers, Billy Quynh suddenly rushed in, holding a gun and a container of gasoline, sending everyone into panic. He shouted incoherently, then charged at her and repeatedly struck her with the butt of the gun. After that, Billy grabbed the victim, yanked her upright, and poured gasoline over her body, ignoring her panicked cries for help. Some other coworkers in the salon fled outside in fear to call 911. Meanwhile, the employee said she smelled the overpowering gasoline and believed she was about to die, but fortunately, the flames did not ignite when he flicked the lighter. Right afterward, she heard a dry click as he pulled the trigger, but no bullet fired. In that tense moment, employees from the neighboring office rushed in, causing the attacker to lose focus. The employee recalled the chaos as a man from the nearby office swung a chair hard into Billy's back. He staggered and turned around, pointed the gun at them, and pulled the trigger, but the weapon still did not fire. At that moment, a neighbor who was armed shouted for Billy to drop the weapon. When he hesitated, the man fired a warning shot into the air. Billy was forced to throw the gun onto the floor and raise his hands in surrender. Thanks to the timely intervention of those courageous witnesses, the employee escaped by a hair's breadth. At the burned house scene, police also interviewed nearby neighbors. Many said they had heard loud arguing coming from the victim's home late at night a few days earlier, and later saw a man leave the house. Notably, a neighbor named Chuck Osbun said the victim had confided in him that she had recently told her boyfriend to move out not long before the incident. This detail led police to believe the motive most likely stemmed from a romantic conflict, and that the case showed signs of retaliation after a breakup. Less than a week later, a Tarrant County grand jury issued an indictment against Billy Quynh on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, aggravated assault, and arson. Because the case resulted in 1 death and another person injured and involved conduct considered especially dangerous to the public, prosecutors pursued the harshest possible approach. As a result, the defendant could face the maximum penalty of the death sentence under Texas law. According to the investigation, the perpetrator was Hung Son Nguyen, also known as Billy, 47 years old at the time of the crime. He was a Vietnamese man living and settled in Texas. According to some sources that have not been officially confirmed, Billy immigrated to the United States as a child and grew up within the Vietnamese community in the Dallas and Fort Worth area. Before the incident, Billy Nguyen lived a relatively quiet life and did not socialize much with those around him. He had previously worked as a nail technician at Lakeside Nail Salon, which was also where he first met the victim. As for his criminal history, prior to 2018, there were no records of any serious prior convictions involving Billy Nguyen. However, what the case revealed showed a clear problem with his ability to control anger. He had an inflated ego, treated his girlfriend as something he owned, and struggled to accept rejection or abandonment. When Pham asked to end the relationship, Billy did not try to talk it through or accept reality. Instead, he gradually nurtured resentment. This was evident in the fact that he prepared a gun, a knife, and gasoline in advance, indicating the act was premeditated rather than an impulsive outburst in the heat of the moment. Notably, Billy's attack on Pham's close coworker also showed he was willing to harm anyone he believed was on the victim's side. According to the sequence reconstructed by investigators, in the early morning of March 9th, 2018, Billy Nguyen brought a knife, a gun, and a container of gasoline, then drove and waited outside Pham's home from early on. At around 8 a.m., as Quynh was preparing to leave for work, Billy approached and demanded to speak with her privately. After a brief argument, in a loss of control, he repeatedly attacked her with the knife, causing the victim to collapse and die at the scene. He then poured gasoline throughout the house and set it on fire in an attempt to erase evidence. As the house began to burn intensely, he quickly left the scene and then went to Lakeside Nail Salon, where Pham had worked. At around 8:45 a.m., he parked in front of the salon, poured gasoline, and set his own vehicle on fire to create chaos, then rushed inside holding a gun and a container of gasoline. Billy attacked a female employee, Pham's close friend, in an act of revenge. However, his lighter would not ignite and his gun repeatedly jammed, causing his brutal plan to fail. During the legal proceedings, defense attorneys considered the possibility of a mental disorder. However, the conclusion was that Billy Nguyen was fully lucid at the time of the crimes and clearly understood his actions. He was not acting in a state of uncontrolled madness, but rather as a person with a distorted mindset who chose extreme violence to resolve a personal conflict. The Billy Nguyen case was quickly brought into the light of justice. After the investigation was completed, Billy Nguyen was charged with the most serious offense, taking a life under especially aggravated circumstances, along with additional charges including intentional injury and arson. Under Texas law, aggravated murder allows the court to impose the maximum penalty of death or life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On June 1st, 2018, a Tarrant County grand jury formally issued an indictment, charging Billy Nguyen with all of the offenses listed above. However, the legal process that followed continued for a considerable period of time. Part of the reason was the exceptionally serious nature of the case, which required both prosecutors and defense attorneys to prepare their filings and arguments with extreme care. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 caused many court proceedings in Texas to be postponed, further delaying the Billy Nguyen case. Faced with overwhelming evidence, defense attorneys understood that an acquittal was virtually impossible. Therefore, they shifted their goal to preventing their client from facing the death penalty. After multiple private negotiations between the prosecution and the defense, Billy Nguyen ultimately agreed to plead guilty in exchange for not being executed. At a court hearing on September 18, 2025, Billy Nguyen stood before a judge of the Tarrant County District Court and formally pleaded guilty to first-degree murder of Pham along with related acts of violence. In return, prosecutors withdrew their request for the death penalty. After reviewing the plea agreement, the judge sentenced Billy Nguyen to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This meant he would spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of returning to society. The Billy Nguyen case sent shockwaves through the Vietnamese community in Texas and drew widespread attention across the Dallas and Fort Worth area in 2018. The public expressed deep sympathy for the victim's family, while also recognizing and praising the courage of the citizens who intervened in time and helped save the second victim. Local media repeatedly reported on the incident, describing it as a severe eruption of violence when a personal conflict escalated into a public tragedy. Many articles and reports approached the case from a social perspective, pointing out troubling consequences and drawing painful lessons. First, the issue of violence in romantic relationships was once again raised as a warning. Reality shows that the most dangerous moment is often when the victim decides to end the relationship. This case was a clear example. Immediately after Pham chose to leave a toxic relationship, she paid the ultimate price with her life. In addition, this case is also a reminder that society and authorities need more effective protection measures for victims trying to escape violence, such as restraining orders, safe housing support, and timely psychological counseling. Tragically, in Pham's case, everything seemed to happen too quickly, leaving her no time to seek any help. And you, if you notice a friend or loved one trapped in an abusive relationship, how would you choose to intervene in a way that is both effective and safe for them? Your sharing could become valuable help for someone else, so please leave your thoughts in the comments. Today's case took place at Lee's Café Bistro in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On the evening of March 3rd, 2016, the restaurant was operating as usual. At around 9 p.m., after sending an order down to the kitchen and waiting more than 10 minutes without seeing the food brought up, the owner began to feel uneasy. Sensing that something was wrong, he decided to go down to the basement food preparation area to check. As soon as he stepped onto the stairs, a horrifying sight appeared before him, leaving him frozen in shock. The restaurant's female chef was lying motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Struggling to regain his composure, he rushed out onto the street to seek help. Fortunately, 2 patrolling police officers happened to be passing by, and he immediately stopped them to report the incident. Just minutes later, law enforcement and emergency medical personnel arrived at the scene. The crime scene was hidden deep in the basement, enveloped by cold white neon lights and the heavy stench of grease and spices. The victim was confirmed dead at approximately 9:15 p.m. that same evening. A very deep and wide wound was found on her neck, indicating that the attacker had acted with extreme force and clear intent to take her life. In addition, bruises on her face and arms revealed that a violent struggle had taken place beforehand. The scene around the body was a horrifying chaos. Pots and pans, knives, and cutting boards were scattered everywhere, with several items even lying on top of the victim. Bloodstains smeared across the walls and floor, mixed with half-prepared food left in mid-cooking. There were even slick, slippery marks at the scene, as if the killer had stepped in a pool of blood while rushing to flee. Still in shock, the restaurant owner was fortunately able to pull himself together enough to say that earlier, the victim had been working in this kitchen with a male employee known by the nickname Noel. But when he came downstairs, he saw only her lying motionless while the other person had vanished. So where was Noel at that moment? And why didn't he call for help or try to assist the victim? This suspicious disappearance immediately made the mysterious man the case's #1 suspect. Based on the limited information the owner provided, police learned the suspect was believed to be between 25 and 30 years old, worked as a kitchen assistant at the restaurant, and owned a white SUV. The leads were still thin, but these were crucial keys for guiding the early stages of the investigation. As for the victim, she was Quynh, 54 years old, a Vietnamese woman who had lived in Philadelphia for decades. The community knew her as gentle and unassuming. She lived with her family in a small house on the 2000 block of Emily Street, not far from her workplace. It was a working-class neighborhood lined with tightly packed 2-story row homes. At Lee's Café Bistro, Quynh was the head chef specializing in traditional Vietnamese dishes. Having worked at the restaurant for a long time, she was trusted by the owner for her honest nature and skilled cooking. In the memories of coworkers and customers, Quynh was a quiet, hardworking woman, always devoted to every dish in her small kitchen. To her neighbors on Emily Street, Quynh was also a reserved, private person who had never been known to have conflicts with anyone. That very privacy meant many neighbors did not even know her real name until this heartbreaking tragedy occurred. Immediately after receiving the initial information at the scene, the Philadelphia Police Department launched a full-scale investigation to track down the killer. At this stage, the main investigative focus was on tracing the whereabouts of the mysterious coworker known as Noel. However, confirming Noel's true identity was far from simple. According to the owner, he had only started working there recently, so his background information was still vague. All they knew was that Noel spoke Spanish, appeared to be an immigrant, and was working as a temporary kitchen assistant, so he had not provided complete identification documents. Facing that situation, police were forced to race against time and deploy a series of investigative measures to find Noel before he could escape. The criminal investigation team spent hours meticulously processing the basement crime scene. Crime scene technicians photographed the entire kitchen as they found it, marking the position of the body and the broken, overturned items. They then searched for and collected fingerprints from every surface likely to have been touched, such as knife handles, refrigerator door handles, and surrounding bottles and containers. In addition, multiple blood samples were collected for analysis to determine whether any belonged to the perpetrator. The forensic team also took DNA samples from beneath the victim's fingernails in case Quynh had scratched or struggled with her attacker and retained skin cells. The blood-stained kitchen knife found near the body, believed to be the murder weapon, was carefully sealed for fingerprint and DNA examination. Preliminary forensic results later showed that, besides the victim's blood, an unknown blood sample was also present at the scene, most likely belonging to the killer. From this detail, investigators initially concluded that the perpetrator may have injured one hand during the struggle. In parallel with the forensic processing, police urgently canvassed witnesses who had been inside the restaurant and in the surrounding area at the time of the incident. 4 employees and 5 diners who were on the second floor at the time were all questioned thoroughly. However, everyone stated they had not heard any cries for help or any unusual disturbance coming from the kitchen below. It was likely that the noise inside the restaurant, combined with the kitchen being isolated in the basement, completely drowned out the sounds of the struggle. Refusing to give up, investigators continued by pulling traffic camera footage at nearby intersections and were fortunate to find an important lead. At approximately 9:12 p.m., a white SUV was recorded speeding away from the Washington Avenue area, near the back of the Oriental supermarket. Based on the headlights in the vehicle's frame, technicians believed it could be the suspect Noel's car. Earlier footage from the Oriental supermarket's cameras also recorded that at around 8:50 p.m., a young Latin man parked a white SUV in the rear lot and then walked toward the restaurant, perfectly matching Noel's work route. This led authorities to be almost certain the suspect drove off immediately after the killing, heading toward the south side of the city. That same night, a bulletin was issued to all patrol units to locate the white SUV, and the information was also widely shared with law enforcement in neighboring states to coordinate a stop and arrest. In addition, thanks to close cooperation from the owner and staff, police obtained a fairly detailed physical description of the suspect. Noel was described as small-framed, about nearly 1.7 meters tall, and likely from Honduras or another Central American country based on his Spanish accent. The owner also recalled that Noel had mentioned living somewhere around the South 9th Street area in Philadelphia. Furthermore, a former employee said Noel's last name was Del Cid. From these valuable leads, police searched within the local Latin immigrant community and discovered a nearly matching name: Noel Orte Lemus del Cid. The suspect was a male, about 27 years old, a Honduran national who had once registered his residence at 1331 South 9th Street, South Philadelphia. Notably, he was described as approximately 1.67 meters tall, slender, with brown hair and brown eyes, a mustache, and a small goatee. These features matched the suspect description with striking accuracy. From that point, the manhunt formally began with a specific identity. A citywide warrant was quickly issued, along with a warning that the suspect could be armed and extremely dangerous. Units were advised not to approach on their own and to immediately notify the tactical team if the suspect was spotted. Another investigative team was immediately dispatched to 1331 South 9th Street, the shared rental apartment where Noel had previously registered. However, he had moved out months earlier, likely around the time he started working at Lee's Café. According to the landlord, the suspect lived very privately and disappeared without a word after owing 2 months of rent. The lead quickly hit a dead end when no one knew where he had gone. Police then tried tracing the phone number Noel had provided when applying for the job, but it was a prepaid line and had already been disconnected. Tracking him through bank cards or public transportation was also impossible because he lived largely outside the formal system. All of these details suggested Noel had carefully planned his escape immediately after committing the crime. Most likely he had luggage already packed in his vehicle and left Philadelphia on the night of March 3rd. While the hunt continued, authorities also worked to answer a crucial question: why did Noel attack Quynh with such brutality? The motive remained a major mystery because there was no family connection or known deep conflict between the victim and the suspect beforehand. Co-workers said the two had only worked together for a few weeks and communicated very little because of the language barrier. Tuong mainly spoke Vietnamese and a little English, while Noel spoke only Spanish. They almost exclusively discussed basic kitchen tasks and had never had any significant disputes. Early theories leaned toward the possibility of a sudden argument during work that escalated into murder. Some speculated Noel may have harassed the victim or lost his temper over disagreements in task assignments and then lost control. Investigators also did not rule out robbery, although in reality there were few valuable items in the kitchen at the time aside from the victim's phone. However, none of these theories could be confirmed without capturing Noel and obtaining his statement. For that reason, police chose to set motive questions aside and concentrate all resources on the most urgent task, apprehending the suspect. Given how dangerous the suspect was believed to be, beginning on March 7, 2016, Philadelphia police widely released information about Noel Ortia Lemus del Cid through the media. Local outlets such as the Philadelphia Inquirer, Philly Voice, and CBS Philly published his photo and identifying characteristics, urging the public to come forward with any leads. To speed up the investigation, authorities offered a reward of $20,000 USD to anyone who provided information leading to the suspect's arrest and conviction. Not stopping there, the Citizens Crime Commission raised an additional $30,000 USD from private sources, bringing the total reward to as much as $50,000 USD. That figure reflected law enforcement's strong determination to bring the killer into the light. In addition, the Vietnamese community in Philadelphia was also asked to help through the press and social media. Information about the case quickly appeared in major Vietnamese language outlets such as Nguyen Viet in California, reflecting deep public concern over the tragic fate of Tuong. Many people actively shared the articles on Facebook in the hope that justice would be found soon. Investigators also reached out to local Honduran community groups in case Noel tried to contact fellow nationals for help hiding. Federal investigators and immigration authorities were quickly alerted to the possibility that the suspect might flee the country, especially by returning to his homeland of Honduras. Noel Ortia Lemus del Cid was immediately placed on the federal wanted list. Interpol even considered issuing a red notice to request assistance from Central American countries if the suspect was detected. However, tracking an immigrant attempting to escape across borders remained an enormous challenge for law enforcement. Time passed, but the investigation still produced no promising results. Every lead on Noel seemed to have evaporated completely. Traffic units also failed to locate any suspicious white SUV, leading investigators to believe Noel had likely changed vehicles or abandoned it somewhere to erase his trail. Telecommunications data showed Noel's phone signal was last detected in southern Delaware, about 100 kilometers from Philadelphia, in the early hours of March 4, 2016. From that point on, no further data was recorded, suggesting the suspect likely disposed of his communication device. Investigators also suspected Noel may have crossed illegally through Mexico to return to Central America, or that he was hiding within an immigrant community in another city. Even so, there was still no solid evidence to confirm these theories. Meanwhile, the forensic evidence collected did little to narrow the search. DNA analysis from the scene indicated an unknown blood sample, most likely belonging to Noel. But because he had no prior criminal record, his DNA profile did not exist in US criminal databases for comparison. Similarly, fingerprints recovered from the handle of the suspected murder weapon were layered and overlapped, making it extremely difficult to separate the victim's prints from the perpetrator's. The investigation appeared to stall. Everyone believed the killer was Noel del Cid, yet locating his hiding place proved to be an exceptionally difficult puzzle. In the years that followed, the Philadelphia Police Department kept the case open and regularly coordinated with Honduran police and federal agencies to continue tracking leads. Noel Ortia Lemus del Cid was placed on Philadelphia's list of most wanted fugitives. On the wanted poster, the words Honduran National were printed in bold to emphasize the suspect's foreign nationality. In May 2018, more than 2 years after the crime, Philadelphia Police and the Crime Commission once again issued a televised appeal, urging the public to provide any leads on Noel del Cid. Authorities decided to raise the reward amount and emphasize that the case remained unsolved in order to reignite public attention. However, the effort still produced no breakthrough, as every tip ultimately led to a dead end. Although they refused to give up hope, investigators had to admit they were facing enormous difficulties. Noel may have been living under a false identity, or residing somewhere no one knew about his criminal past. And if the suspect had truly fled back to Honduras, where extradition to the United States is not always straightforward, then the chances of capturing him became more fragile than ever. Even though he had not been caught, investigators were still able to sketch a relatively clear profile of the suspect, Noel Ortega Lemus del Cid, through information gathering. Noel was believed to have been born around 1988 or 1989 in Honduras, a turbulent Central American country. He was a Honduran citizen who migrated to the United States, most likely through illegal immigration routes sometime in the 2010s. Details about his family were unclear. It is possible he came to the United States alone to make a living, leaving relatives behind in his home country. In Philadelphia, Noel quickly blended into the Spanish-speaking immigrant community, concentrated mainly in South Philly. He supported himself through various low-wage jobs, such as kitchen prep work, dishwashing, and occasionally day labor with construction crews. Residency records indicated Noel had rented rooms at multiple addresses across the city, but never stayed anywhere for long. This suggested an unstable, drifting lifestyle. In terms of identifying features, Noel Ortega Lemus del Cid was short and small-framed, about 1.67 meters tall and around 68 kilograms. He had typical Latin features: short brown hair, brown eyes, and a tan complexion. Noel often wore a thin mustache and a small patch of beard beneath his chin. According to coworkers, his posture was slightly hunched, and he rarely made eye contact when speaking with others. At work, Noel appeared withdrawn but fairly diligent, possibly due in part to the language barrier, which meant he spoke little to anyone except a few fellow countrymen. According to the owner of Lee's Café, when Noel applied for the job, he did not present complete identification documents. However, because the restaurant was short-staffed, they agreed to hire him temporarily while waiting for additional paperwork. Noel had only been working there for a few weeks when the tragedy occurred. Notably, throughout that time, no one reported any unusual behavior from him. There were absolutely no loud arguments or major conflicts on record. As for his legal record, up until the crime, Noel had no known criminal history in the United States. If he had, police would have been able to identify him more easily through fingerprint or DNA matches. Even so, investigators did not rule out the possibility that back in Honduras, Noel may have been involved in illegal activities that had never been discovered. Honduras is widely known as a place where many young people become entangled with gangs, drug crime, or street violence, and that environment may have contributed to shaping Noel's aggressive tendencies. The connection between the suspect and the victim, Quynh, seemed to exist only within the confined space of Lee's Café's kitchen. They did not know each other beforehand at all, because Quynh had been a long-term employee while Noel had only been hired for a short time. The age gap of more than 25 years, along with the language barrier, meant the two had very little personal interaction. Although no outward conflict was ever clearly reported, police suspected Noel may have carried unspoken resentment toward the victim related to work such as task assignments or corrections and reminders in the kitchen. If that hypothesis was true, it is possible those frustrations accumulated and erupted violently on the fateful night. Another view suggested Noel suffered psychological instability due to the pressures of making a living in a foreign country, leading to an uncontrolled act of violence. However, because the suspect had not been captured for questioning, everything remained speculation. Because the suspect, Noel Ortega Lemus del Cid, has still not been arrested, the murder of Quynh has not been brought to trial. Even so, the case file has been prepared by the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, with charges including homicide, aggravated assault, and use of a weapon resulting in death. The moment Noel is captured, the justice system will immediately initiate proceedings to bring him before the court. If he is arrested in the United States, Noel would face trial in Philadelphia. Given the brutality of the crime, prosecutors would certainly seek the harshest possible sentence. Under Pennsylvania law, the typical punishment for first-degree murder is life imprisonment without parole. However, the situation would become far more complicated if Noel were arrested abroad. If he were hiding in his homeland of Honduras, the United States would have to pursue diplomatic procedures to request extradition because the country does not automatically surrender its citizens. That process could take years and could even fail if the suspect changed his identity or encountered political obstacles. In reality, there have been precedents where killers hid overseas for decades before finally being captured. Even so, the Philadelphia Police Department has remained persistent, working with federal and international partners with a firm determination to track down Noel. In the meantime, under the U.S. legal system, Quynh case has been temporarily classified as a cold case. Although the killer has not yet been brought to trial, authorities have stated that the case file will never be closed. The moment Noel reappears and is taken into custody, justice will be carried out. Until then, the trial of Noel Ortega Lemus del Cid remains an empty space, leaving a long, exhausting wait for the victim's family and the entire community. Nearly 10 years have passed since that fateful night at Lee's Café, Bistro, yet the murder of Chef Quynh still has no final resolution. The fact that the perpetrator remains at large continues to torment the victim's family, while local residents feel uneasy knowing a dangerous criminal has still not been captured. More than that, the case has left deep social impacts, serving as a painful wake-up call about workplace safety and community security. Quynh tragedy also raises a major question about lax hiring practices. Perhaps the carelessness of accepting an employee with an unclear background like Noel unintentionally created a security gap, one that gave evil an opening to emerge. Within overseas Vietnamese communities, Quynh case sparked a wave of outrage mixed with profound sympathy. Many Vietnamese language newspapers in the United States continued to update the investigation, hoping the perpetrator would soon face legal punishment. Back in Vietnam, the press also paid special attention to the case, treating it as a painful reminder for Vietnamese living abroad about the security risks of life in a foreign land. However, over time, as the investigation reached repeated dead ends, media attention gradually cooled, and this heartbreaking story risked fading into obscurity. To this day, the case still leaves many major questions unanswered. For example, what was Noel Ortega Lemus del Cid's true motive? Was it merely a moment of sudden anger? Or were there deeper hidden tensions between him and the victim? Leave your theories in the comments, and don't forget to share this video so the suspect's image can spread more widely, helping support the ongoing search for justice. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you can continue joining Vietnamese Case Files on future journeys into the shadows of the next cases. For now, goodbye and see you in tomorrow's episode.